My question is, so for context, my Kundalini awakening began very suddenly and abruptly with an LSD trip. And I've had a lot of, that was like 2.5 years ago. And my process has brought me so much suffering. The weird thing is that at the same time that I don't want more suffering, I do recognize a part of me that actually feels that actually anticipates more suffering for good reasons. And the thing is that, for one, I think that I might have gotten myself, or here's the thing. 3 days before I had the LSD trip, I was listening to a podcast, and one of the people there, told of all his trauma and of all his devastating childhood and all the things that he went through. And a voice in my mind popped up that said, "Oh man, why haven't I experienced so much trauma? I wish I would have gone through the same kind of things, or I wish I would have experienced a similar major trauma to gain all of these superpowers from it." And 3 days later, I have the most horrible experience of my life that left me with also PTSD. And so there's still, even though for two years or something, I've gone through periods of real, just immense suffering, there's still a part of me that doesn't agree with the statement that I have suffered enough or something like that, because it thinks that because there's a belief that the more suffering I experience, the more empathy that I get, the more appreciation for life I get. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And so just I'm curious, do you think that it's possible that with this belief in me, I am actually manifesting potentially worse outcomes for me? And yeah, if so, how can I transcend this? Because I know that there must be some flaw in this belief.
Yeah, this is interesting, Jonas. On this path, in life in general, you could say there's two types of suffering. There's suffering for the sake of suffering, and there's suffering for the sake of moving out of suffering. Subtle distinction. Suffering can provide great context to understand what it is, to understand how to relate with it so that we don't need to suffer so much anymore. Or it can just be something that we face and don't learn anything from it, don't grow through it. And so those who understand that suffering can help us to overcome suffering sometimes can get a little excited about it and say, oh, well, there's more growth here. Let's do it. Let's see what happens. I think that's a great stance to take. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of maturity. It takes a lot of confidence. Eventually, if you're actually getting something out of the suffering, learning from it, growing from it, healing through it, there'll come a point where you do reach a point of stability where there's, generally speaking, a lot of peace. Suffering will still come and go, but it won't be so debilitating anymore, generally speaking. So hopefully with this attitude that you have, you will come to a point where the suffering actually does come to a point where it no longer needs to arise so much, as opposed to you thinking that because you're looking at suffering from such a perspective that you're manifesting more unnecessarily. I don't really think that's the case. I don't think that's the case. I think you're going to get the suffering that you need to bring you to the point where you don't need to suffer so much anymore. Jonas, as I was saying, I feel that you don't need to worry that being sort of mature about suffering, looking for the growth in suffering is going to manifest more suffering. I think you'll come to a point where, you know, you get what you're looking for, which is to overcome the resistance to suffering, and you can just begin to flow with it. I know that Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass's guru, he said something along the lines of, I like suffering. Suffering brings me closer to God. I can relate with this. I've never been closer to God more than when I've been, on my knees in pain, with sickness, with illness, with emotional stuff, with heartbreak, with fear. Never been closer to God, to be quite honest. Um, and so your stance is not something unusual. It's quite a profound stance, to be so confident in the suffering's benefits for you. Um, you also don't want to fall into like a sort of, what's the word, sadomasochist type of thing where you're actively looking for suffering, causing suffering for yourself. That's different. If it comes to you, you work with it. But I think in time you'll come to a point where the suffering teaches you what it needs to teach you, and it doesn't need to rise so intensely.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's so scary for me because like whenever I hear people talking about like, I don't know, someone got long COVID and talks about how devastating that was for them, there's immediately a part of me that says, oh, that would be interesting to experience long COVID, because then I would have to go through all these things, and would make me it would make me shine even brighter when I went through to the other side and stuff like that. And it's yeah, I'm just paranoid about this part manifesting actually more suffering.
Not unnecessarily. It may manifest a suffering that you need to grow, but it was not just going to bring you suffering in vain for no reason. God's not a psychopath. That's the way that I like to think about it. And I learned that from Matt Kahn. He said, God is not a psychopath. So you don't have to fear. Like I was saying about Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Das, his guru Maharaji. Like he said, I love suffering. Suffering brings you closer to God. He didn't, it's not like, he suddenly was lit on fire because that was his attitude. I could say I love suffering too. Suffering has been very empowering for me. It's been my greatest teacher. But I'm not suffering in this moment just because I said that. God's not a psychopath. Okay. So you can trust you'll get what you need, and not more, but also not less. And I think your attitude is very, very mature, very mature.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
No, you're welcome. You're welcome.